Well, thanks for coming. This is coming out of some research that I've been doing in other areas, and I got interested in this question about 7 or 8 about a year ago. I'm going to give you a little overview of how I got into it, and then I'm going to talk about what makes a sin a deadly sin for the people that we're looking at here, give you some background information, and then we'll actually go into looking at a few of these that I have on that chart for you. And then I'll talk a little bit how it got disseminated into the larger medieval culture. And we can take questions and discuss things at any point along the way, but then we'll maybe do some discussion and Q&A specifically after that. And then afterwards I have, right now the screen is blank because we've got it turned off, I have a slideshow of interesting depictions of the 7 deadly sins or of their punishments, things connected to them. Some of them are classic representations starting from about the Renaissance on. Some of them are very contemporary representations that you may have seen or you may not have seen. So I'm Gregory Sadler. I teach at Fayetteville State for another week and a half or so. And I'm actually leaving and starting a new phase of my career up north from here. I work in philosophy and religious studies, and one of my areas of particular interest is vices and virtues. So that's how I got caught up in this. I've been doing a lot of work on the virtues and vices associated with anger. And since anger is considered one of the 7 deadly sins, or one of the 8 deadly sins, depending on which list you're looking at, makes every single list, sooner or later, if I'm researching and I'm doing a broad enough study, I'm going to get drawn in to reading somebody's thought on this list about anger. And I saw them talking about anger as one of the principal sins, and in order to understand a philosopher or a theologian, you have to look at their work as a whole. You can't just begin from one little portion. You have to read through it. So, because I was looking at people like John Cassian or Thomas Aquinas or St. Bonaventure, studying anger inevitably meant looking at this notion of the 7 deadly sins or the 8 deadly sins. What I was surprised to find out when I first read John Cassian, I'd always heard of 7 deadly sins, and I think most of us probably have that experience too. You've probably seen, say, the movie 7, and probably a lot of you can rattle off the list, in fairly close order. You might mix them up, put one in place of the other. But we're all used to thinking of 7 deadly sins. So when I opened up John Cassian's conferences and his institutes, and I saw that there were 8 principal faults, I thought, what's going on here? And then I looked at his listing, and I said, well, where's envy? It's not in there. And what are these other 2 in there? How did this happen? So I became very interested in this, and it turns out there's actually a literature on this. Many other people have noticed this, including some of the people we're going to look at tonight. So I started this larger comparative project of looking at treatments of the deadly sins. And I started with theology and philosophy, because that's my area. And I'm expanding that study. This is actually just about halfway in. And I've gotten interested in how it fits into the culture, how it affects the culture, but also how it filters into literature and drama and artwork. I'm not an art historian, I'm not an English professor or anything like that, but I think that you can recognize some of the same themes being treated very interestingly, almost in a philosophical way, in, say, Dante or Chaucer, or perhaps in some of the art that we're going to look at. So, what makes a sin deadly? Do any of you remember from, catechism or, any other place where you, yeah?
What harms yourself and others?
Yeah, although there's a whole bunch of sins, and all of them harm self or others in one way or another. It's not enough to make it a deadly or a capital or a principal sin. So there's got to be something more. We tend tend to think of it as in terms of the punishment or the penalty. It's a deadly sin because it's really, really bad. Well, how come murder isn't on the list? That's pretty bad, right?
Which one?
Murder.
Oh, murder.
I mean, you know,
Yes, yes.
if I was posed with the choice of somebody lusting or murdering, I'd say, go ahead and lust and don't murder, right? If I had to pick between the two. Or go ahead and envy, but maybe don't bear false witness. You know, don't send somebody to prison on false testimony or something like that. So it's not the penalty itself, although that's what our culture has come to frame it as. Originally, they didn't call them deadly sins. They called them the principal sins, or the capital sins. And a lot of times they didn't actually call them sins, they called them vices. Yeah?
They could lead to other sins.
Yeah, there you go. They not only can lead to other sins, these are the big ones that tend to produce other sins. That's why they wanted to concentrate on these. That's why they picked them out. That's why they came up with some sort of listings of these. So that, you know, they can provide motives for other sins. Sometimes they take shape in other sins. You know, if you think about wrath or anger, the ancients and the medievals distinguished more than one thing that would come out of it. More than one way of being excessively or wrongly angry. These are all actually, though, vices. And so to understand what these were for the people that are writing about them, it helps to know something a little bit about this notion of vice. And again, this is a word that we use in our culture, but we use it for what? What's an example of a vice?
Drug abuse, prostitution.
Yeah, well, the vice squad stuff, right? Yeah, and abuse of drugs is in fact something that would fit under what they call vice. You don't just do it once, you do it habitually, right? Usually people say stuff like smoking. Smoking is a vice, you know. And then you can think about, why is it a vice? That's a dirty habit. Now you're actually getting closer, because what is a vice? A vice is a habit. It's a disposition to do a certain kind of thing. So if I have a vicious disposition with respect to anger, that means that I, not only once in a while, but habitually, when I'm put into situations, I get angry at people that I shouldn't, or I get too angry, or too quickly, or I don't forgive when I ought to. There's a lot of different possibilities for that. If I have a vice of envy, that means that I don't just envy once in a while. That's part of my character. That's part of what I do. And that's part of, you know, in case for better or for worse, in this case it's for worse, that's part of who I am. So virtues and vices are, you know, the good and the bad moral character traits that we develop. Or sometimes, you know, we're stuck with. So all of these are vices, and all of them are opposed to certain virtues. This understanding of them it didn't come out of a vacuum. It's not as if the church just showed up and said, all right, we need a list of 7 bad things. Let's come up with them. What do we want to put a stop to? Instead, it came out of a very different kind of context. Where are these things discussed first, before Christianity comes on the scene? In ancient philosophy. So you have Plato and Aristotle and the Stoics and many other people talking about, you know, what makes a person good, what makes a person bad. Well, it's possession of certain virtues or vices. And then they start thinking about, how do you, let's say you have vices, how do you move away from them? Does it involve just gaining some knowledge? Does it involve changing your habits? Does it involve changing the way in which you feel or desire or think about things? Those are the sort of things that they were preoccupied with. And when the first Christian writers are on the scene, you know, after the Gospels, after the Epistles, although Paul himself, you know, had studied, and he didn't just study Torah, he knew ancient culture. They engaged ancient philosophy. So Christian thought about this doesn't just come, say, straight out of the scriptures that they had at the time. It comes out of a lot of reflection, a lot of engagement with the culture of their time, which included philosophy. And philosophy was understood a little bit differently back then than it is now. I belong to not a department of philosophy, but a philosophy area within a department of government and history. And if you ask people, well, what's philosophy? They might say something like, well, you know, what that guy over there teaches. You know? And then you say, well, what is he teaching? Well, I don't know, let's go to the bookstore and look at the books that he's assigning. That's philosophy. Well, that's a very small part of it. And that's not what the ancients thought of as philosophy, because there wasn't any me back then, or Fayetteville State, or textbooks, or anything like that. What did they think of philosophy as being? Well, it was actually a way of life. A way of life that was ordered and carried out according to certain principles. That's what made it different than, say, just going out and doing whatever you wanted. And different philosophies began from different sets of principles. And they were trying to orient themselves to what was best, what they thought was most worthwhile. So all of this stuff about virtues and vices fits in with that. That's why they were studying these things. They were trying to make sense out of the human experience of good and evil in the world. And we've all encountered that. All of us are adults. We've all met good people. We've met bad people. We can probably say why we think this person is good, why we think that one is bad. We can have arguments with each other about whether they really are good or bad, or just perhaps misunderstood. But the fact that we can actually talk about this and agree about this means there's a reality that we're studying, something that we're interested in. And they were just as interested in that 2,000 years ago as we are today, perhaps more. They couldn't distract themselves with smartphones and television and things like that. And how did they do this? Well, they drew on a lot of different sources. Some of it is experience. You watch people, you see how they act. You can't actually see the inside of somebody's soul, or their brain, or their heart, or however you want to put it. But you can watch their behavior over time. You can see how they behave in certain situations. And you can start to generalize about people on that basis. Teaching. These Christian authors, they are not working in a vacuum, but neither were the ancient philosophers. If you read Plato's dialogues, Plato actually has Socrates saying, well, this other guy over here says this. He's reacting, he's either accepting or rejecting somebody else's teaching. Drama and narrative, the ancient Greeks, why did they love Homer so much? Because he told good stories? I mean, there are good stories. Why did they think he was so important? We read him because he's part of a literature class, right? And it's good that we do that. We don't set up our lives according to Homer, though, do we? Some of those Greeks were. They would say, well, you should be like Odysseus. Or you should be like, this guy over here. Or they would take a speech and they would say, hey, that's got some real insight in it. Let's make something out of this. Another thing that they were interested in was understanding human nature. These are people that were really concerned with that. And that continues through to these Christian authors. Again, there's sort of a tendency to look at them as if they're primarily interested in otherworldly things. When you start talking about the vices and the virtues, or what we're going to call here the principal or capital sins, you're really interested in human nature. You're interested in two ways. How is it damaged, and how ought it to be? The deadly sins are those which lead us away for these authors, from how we ought to be, what we were made to be. And the ancients, they had their own listings of virtues and vices, and when Christianity comes on the scene, it brings some new ones, or it revalues some old ones. A good example of this is humility. Humility was not seen as a good thing for most of the Greeks. It was seen as being servile, as being something less than what you ought to be. Aristotle says some bad things about it. What does Christianity say about humility?
The meek shall inherit the earth.
The meek shall inherit the earth, although actually meek is something different. What we translate as meek, well, it is connected. What we translate as meek is the Greek word that in say, Aristotle's text is translated as good-tempered or mild, praotes. And meekness or mildness has to do with anger. Meekness means not losing your temper, having a good disposition, being able to put up with other people's things without getting excessively angry at them, which is a natural human thing to do. Right? Do most of us err on the side of getting too angry or not angry enough? Well, most of us, though. We can err on both, but if we look at our experience. Yeah, and so the meek, that same Greek word is being used for all these things, and we don't realize it because we translate it differently in the Gospels than we do in, say, Aristotle. Moses is also called meek, praus. And think about it, Moses is a guy who put people to death. But he behaved he didn't do it because he was trying to get revenge or anything like that. Meekness is not exactly the same thing as humility, but it's tied in with it. It's tied in with patience. It's tied in with these other virtues that Christianity comes on the scene and says, yeah, you guys were mixed up about this. Here's a better way to live. So Christianity doesn't just wipe all this context away. It takes it and integrates it as best as it can. Are there still some tensions there? Probably. And we could talk more about that. Now, there's a couple different ways of understanding these deadly sins or these capital sins. And these tie in with what these people were trying to do. Why were they so keen to identify these vices or these complexes of behavior and thinking and desires? Well, it could be they just wanted to control people, right? They just wanted to set a stamp down and say, thou shalt not. And there always have been people who would use these lists in such ways. And we're going to talk about a time where that became more prevalent. But if you actually look at the people that I've got on that chart and the people we're going to look at tonight, what were they about? What were they writing these books for? They were trying to help people in the path towards spiritual life. Most of them at the start are monks out in the desert. They're not writing for lay people. They're writing for how the monk, the person who's really, really serious about this whole Christian idea and wants to go off and leave things behind, what should they be focusing on? What sort of dangers and challenges are they going to face? What do they have to know about themselves in order to not fall prey to things? Later on, something a bit different gets done with it. Later on, it's to assist those who are preaching or doing spiritual direction or particularly confession. And we'll talk about that in a little while. So one of the first people that we get something like this with is this guy Cyprian. He's in the 3rd century. And a lot of people had mentions of different sins. If you look at Paul's letters, he'll rattle off, don't do this, don't do this, don't do this, whole lists of sins. But nobody had sort of codified them and tried to think out, their connections with each other. Cyprian is starting to do that. And Cyprian also notes something kind of interesting, which is when we knock down one of the big ones, one of the ones that we've really been struggling with, what happens next, do you think? Everything, the heavens open up and the angels sing and it's all happy ever after?
You got 6 to go.
There you go. Yeah, when you knock down one vice, others start to assert themselves more. They start to make their claims more strongly. The next guy is on your chart. It's this Evagrius Ponticus, who's in the 4th century. He's a monk, and he's out in the desert, and he is coming up with a listing of what he calls not the principal vices or sins, but the main thoughts that are going to be suggested. And he thinks they're going to be suggested by not just our own nature, but by the agency of demons who want to screw us up, who want to trip us up, they can't make us do anything, but they can keep bothering us with things that they know will push our buttons until we decide to give in to them. And so he talks about 8 different generic tempting thoughts. And he says that these contain within themselves all the other ones. So this goes to, they tend to bring about other vices. One of them is gluttony. The pleasures of eating, drinking, the desires for that to an excessive amount. Then there's something that we can translate. It's translated in a lot of ways. Fornication, lust. There's a lot of sort of euphemistic ways of rendering it. But it's basically lust. Sexual desire that is oriented in the wrong ways, and that it wants to satisfy itself too much, too often, with the wrong objects, that sort of thing. Covetousness, or greed. Often we see the literature calling it covetousness because the King James Version used that. Another word for it is avarice. The Greek word itself literally means love of money, but it can mean wealth in general, love of material possessions. That's what greed is. Then anger. This is kind of a tricky one. Does that mean that you can't ever be angry at all? That's what some of these guys thought. Like John Cassian, for example, thought it's never good to be angry. Not all of the people that you're going to look at on that chart thought it was never good to be angry. Thomas Aquinas saw a legitimate place for it. Here's where it got really interesting. So this is 8 principal vices. This isn't the list of the 7 deadly sins. The 7 deadly sins does not have sadness on it, or dejection, or there's other ways of describing this. We tend to look at that as not involved with that at all. That's a feeling we have. But again, think about, why are these problematic? Well, because they lead to either doing things that we shouldn't do, or not doing the things that we ought to be doing. If we're chronically depressed, are we likely to do the things that we ought to do? Probably not. And this could lead to an interesting conversation about what roles do we have in depression if we're facing it. And there are clearly some people, in our time that we would say, oh, it's a chemical problem. But there's other therapies, and some of the most successful ones, like cognitive behavior therapy, they incorporate the insights of these ancient philosophers or theologians. And they say that you actually have some role, you have some agency in how you feel. And Evagrius would say that as well. Then there's something else that is hard to translate. And they used the Greek term for it, they just turned it into a Latin term, Akkadi, or Akkadia. And it means something like, it's something fairly similar to this sadness or dejection. Heaviness or weariness of heart. The way it's described, it seems to be a kind of being distracted with things. This is the one that's going to turn later on into sloth, when Thomas gets a hold of it. Then there's something called kenodoxia, which means literally empty appearance, or vainglory we call it. And boasting gets placed into this. And then finally, the worst one, pride. All right? And from here we go to John Cassian. Cassian takes Evagrius' list, and he's a Latin Westerner. He's a little bit later in the 4th to 5th century. He goes off to the east and he studies with these monks. He wants to learn their way of life. There aren't a lot of monasteries in the west at that time. So he goes first to Syria and Jerusalem, and then he goes down to Egypt where they're stricter. And he lives with them for many years, and he talks with them for many years. Actually, he has a friend who goes with him. And then they go all the way back to Marseille. And when people make him write a book, he writes a book about it. But he doesn't do it until they bother him enough to do it. And these are called his institutes and then his conferences. His conferences are actually narrations of conversations that he had with these abbots way out in the boonies, in the middle of nowhere. And the institutes are his sort of trying to figure this stuff out himself and systematize it. And he has the same basic 8 schema as Evagrius does, but he tells us some more interesting things about this. He says that gluttony is the first one that we have to address, and that if you don't address gluttony, and again, he's talking to monks, If you don't address gluttony, if you don't get the urges of the body under control, you're going to have a really hard time with all of the rest of them. And then, lust comes after that. You start working on that. And, we often think of these religious people as almost inhuman, as if they don't have sexual urges. If you read this monastic literature, these guys were really struggling with that stuff all the time. Sometimes even when they were quite old. Covetousness. This is one that leads to a lot of different things. He says, leads to lying, to deceit, to false witness. I looked at Cassian a lot on anger, and I talked about that several months ago here in a different talk. Cassian took a very, very strict stance on anger. He said that we should never be angry except with ourselves. Any other case of being angry is culpable. It's leading to problems. And this is an interesting case because there are certain scriptural passages that talk about anger, and some theologians interpreted them to say, for instance, you shouldn't be angry with your brother unless you have good cause. Cassian says, no way, there's never good cause. So he's really a hardliner about this. Dejection, he gives us a bit more description about this that helps us understand it. It makes us unhospitable. It makes us unwilling to engage in projects, to be with other people. Does this sound a little bit more like depression? Yeah. It can also make us despair about salvation, and then we just say, screw it. I'm not going to do anything. I'm going to do whatever I want. And you notice that's a tendency that would then produce other problems, wouldn't it? He also talks about Acadia, and he says this is a weakness or distress of heart. This is also the noonday devil that gets mentioned in the Psalms. And he talks about it as a sort of, there's two different ways he talks about it. One is a sort of dissatisfaction with oneself and one's spiritual progress and everything that's going on with oneself, and not sticking to your work, not putting yourself in your work, finding fault with it. So it produces a kind of laziness. This is why it's going to lead ultimately to sloth. He also talks about, and I guess this must have been a real problem for these monks, he talks about being distracted, not settling down and doing things. So what these monks would do, here's what he actually singles out. They would say, I think I shouldn't work on this stuff today. I should go see how brother so-and-so is doing. I should go check up on him. And then they go and check up on him, and they're not feeling any better because they didn't address what was going on inside them. And now the work's not done either. And now there's sort of this cycle to it. And now they come back, and then they think, yeah, I really got to settle down and get this done, don't I? But, there's something else going on over there I should go check out, too. Anybody who's had to get something done at the last minute because they procrastinated has gone through Acadia. Vainglory. Cassian tells us something really interesting about vainglory. He says that the other vices, they're pretty straightforward. They attack you, and if they get you down, they kick you. He doesn't say it quite like that. That's part of our parlance. Vainglory arises when you're doing pretty good. So if you master your anger, or you master your sloth, then what's the next tendency? Man, I'm doing pretty good. I'm a really spiritual person. I'm a lot more spiritual than that guy over there. I should probably be abbot. I should be giving people, lectures about how one ought to be living the spiritual life. I ought to be preaching. He talks about it like this. That's vainglory, thinking too much of oneself. And then finally, something that's very close to it is pride. And pride actually, we don't have envy in this list. Where does envy come in? Pride produces envy. Because what is pride? Pride is thinking that oneself is greater, is better than other people. It's something a little bit different than vainglory. And Cassian says something really interesting about this. He says, with each of these other vices, they're opposed to some other virtue. A virtue is a way that we ought to be. So think about meekness, right? We ought to be meek. That means that we shouldn't get angry. We shouldn't, somebody cuts you off, you shouldn't give them the finger. You should control your anger. And eventually you should learn how to forgive fairly quickly. So there's a vice and there's an opposed virtue, right? Gluttony, what would be opposed to that, do you think? We don't actually use the word much anymore.
Fasting?
Fasting is how you beat it. But fasting is not an end in itself. And Cassian actually writes about these people who fast too much for the wrong reason. He says that's no good either. But what could fasting be part of? Because you're on the right track.
Cleansing?
What's that?
Spiritual cleansing of the body?
Well, the body and the soul are connected for these guys. See, we don't actually use the word much. Moderation, temperance, that's the virtue of taking the amount that we actually need and not more. Why do we eat more than we need to? Because eating is so much fun and tastes so good, and it satisfies a natural need. But then there's so many wonderful tasting things out there that we could eat all day long and drink all day long, and people have done that sort of thing. So if you're a glutton, you don't have the virtue of moderation. It's been destroyed in you. If you're wrathful, you don't have the virtue of meekness, right? Or mildness, or however you want to put it, patience. Pride, Cassian says, is not like that. Pride destroys all of the virtues. It's sort of like the atom bomb of vices. And he says it's not opposed to a virtue or to an angel that's supposed to help us with that virtue. It's opposed to God himself. Because what is pride ultimately? You can think of pride in terms of other people, right? If I'm prideful, I'm better than all of you, whether I really am or not. In my mind, I'm better than all of you, and so I should get more stuff than all of you, whether it's money, attention, food. I should get better stuff than all of you too. And when we have conversations, I should get to talk, you should get to listen. It goes on and on, right? Like this. Well, why? Now put it in a Christian context. So there's a transcendent God who created all of us. If I take that sort of position and I say I am so worthwhile, everything I've got that's good, is mine, came from me. I'm placing myself above God. Because, rightly understood, none of that good stuff came really from me. Where did it come from? Whatever qualities I may have that are good, in a Christian context, came from God. I may have, done some polishing and fixing them up, but I didn't create, my being. I didn't create where I wound up. I didn't create the opportunities that I was given. So pride is very dangerous.
Well, in the Judeo-Christian context, isn't pride the original sin?
Yes.
The servant saying you're going to be God if you eat this apple.
Well, that's interesting. It's the original sin for human beings, but it's not the original sin, right? Because before the fall of Adam and Eve, there's another fall that takes place. Right. And now Lucifer is an angel. So he's not going to fall through gluttony or lust or anything, because he doesn't have a body. He's a purely, according to this stuff, he's a purely spiritual being. And what good didn't he possess? What could possibly have been his incentive for with as much knowledge as he has, saying, screw you to God. I'm going to do things my way. Pride. It's the only answer. And so to be engaged in that is in a way to be Luciferian. And again, common sin, and it is for Cassian and for the rest of these people, it is the one which the other ones come out of ultimately. Why do we do any of these things? Pride is at the root of them. Let me go on then to I should have numbered these. Here we go. Gregory the Great. I don't know how many Gregories there actually were that were theologians. I know I think there were, unless I'm mistaken, there's 12 popes, right? That were Gregory?
No, I don't know.
Or was it 16?
My Catholic history.
Yeah, but there are a lot of other theologians named Gregory. This is the only one who gets called the Great, so he's easy to keep track of. And he's a Benedictine monk. And he actually writes a life of Saint Benedict when he's got some free time. As a matter of fact, he didn't like being pope. He didn't like being bishop. He didn't like being anything. Whenever they gave him an opportunity, he would run away and try to get back to the monastery. And they would make it, they like forced him to be pope, the poor guy. Now he writes this book called Moralia in Job. And it's a book of scriptural interpretation. Back then, they had this notion that Scripture has a number of different senses, a number of different ways that you can read it. And one of these is the moral sense. What is Scripture telling? How is Scripture telling us we ought to behave, we ought to be? And so he's reading the book of Job and trying to draw all the possible moral lessons from it. And this was a very popular book in the Middle Ages, as was John Cassian's conferences and institutes. And there's one chapter in there where he talks about the principal sins. And this is the one where we start to see the transition from 8 to 7. He doesn't actually say that there's only 7 per se and that's it. He actually treats 8 of them. But what does he do? He takes pride and he says pride is the fountain that all the other ones flow from. He doesn't call pride one of the principal sins or capital sins. He names the other 7. And this is where that listing later on comes from. He also changes it a little bit. Most of the sins that are there are the same as John Cassian or Evagrius have. But envy's added. Envy is picked out now as something to focus on. Whereas John Cassian didn't do that. And Acadia is more or less rolled into sadness. They're not yet calling it sloth at this point. They're looking at it under the rubric of sort of being dejected, of sadness, of gloominess is another way it gets translated. And he talks about a progression of 5 different of these vices coming right from pride. Pride leads to vainglory, because if you place yourself above everything else, you're going to have an overly high opinion of yourself, aren't you? Right? And if you are vainglorious, then you are going to be envious too, aren't you? Because what is the reality that you experience? If you think you're better than everybody else, does everybody else treat you that way? They give prizes to all sorts of other people. That should be your prize, right? Nobody else should be getting the gold star, because nobody else deserves it. Then you'll become envious. And then what do you think is going to follow from that? If you have to pick another one of these principal vices.
Anger?
Exactly. Because, you really have a good reason to be angry, don't you? Now, when you get angry, what's going to happen after that? This is kind of interesting. They had a lot of insight into human nature. You've all been angry. You've all lost your temper, right? I'm going to assume that. How do you feel afterwards when you're no longer angry?
Sad.
Yeah. Why?
Because you sad because you were angry and you're sad.
You could be sad because you lost your temper. And you'd meant not to do it anymore, and you're lamenting your poor spiritual state or how little progress you've made. I know I've felt that. What else, though? What else might you be sad?
Tired.
What's that?
Tired.
Yeah, when you get into a knockdown, drag-out argument with somebody that goes on for hours and hours, when you're done, you are just wiped out, and you're not ready to work, and you're not ready to do the things that you ought to be doing. What else? What do you do when you're angry that might make you sad later?
You do things you regret. You say bad things to
Yes. Yeah. So sometimes the sadness or dejection comes over the effects of one's own anger. Now, if you don't have anger problems, if you've got a really well-tempered temper, then you won't have that sort of thing happening. But, you know, a lot of us can relate to that.
You also
Now-
feel kind of empty afterwards, empty,
Yeah,
because suddenly you're
and sometimes driveless.
given up or something.
Yeah, well, you know, when you're angry, and this is one reason why anger can become actually addictive, you have a purpose.
Yeah.
You know exactly what you're going to do. As a matter of fact, you are, focused on this one thing, how you are right and that person is wrong, and how everyone else should know it, and they have to pay, and it goes on and on. You have a motivation. Yeah, when you take that away, sometimes people do feel empty. They feel sort of resourceless, as if they've got nowhere to go. Now, when you feel that sort of disappointment, especially if it has to do with yourself and the goods that you thought that you had, you want to feel good. If you're not going to get it from inside yourself, where are you going to get it?
From gluttony.
Not yet.
Okay.
Although you're right, that's another. Gregory doesn't talk about that. It's kind of interesting because in our society we do have people who their response to conflict is to go eat, or their response to depression is to go eat. I don't think that Gregory saw that as an issue. He saw the thing that you're going to have to worry about is greed, covetousness. People try to fill in that gap with all sorts of external things. And, can you ever do it? Will it ever be satisfied? No. So your greed can't actually be satisfied. These are all, he says, spiritual vices, and they come ultimately from pride. It's kind of interesting. He doesn't talk about gluttony coming from that. And he considers gluttony and lust to be different. They're more bodily, more carnal vices. They come from our natural tendencies. And he thinks, this is a little quaint, that if you indulge gluttony, then you will inevitably end up being lustful. And, we could maybe see this as, these guys fasted a lot. And what happens when you fast? A lot of your body's things start to shut down and to be a little bit more manageable. And they didn't have a high-calorie diet anyway. I mean, he's writing at the beginning of the Dark Ages. When winters are getting longer, it's actually a cooling period in the Earth's history, as well as a terrible time for culture. He says, well, if you satisfy the belly, the parts that are affected by lust are actually so close by that they're going to be affected too, and then you're going to have problems there. Which strikes me as a little bit implausible, but who knows? Maybe this was based on something. Now he talks about all of these with a metaphor. He says that, because this passage in Job is actually, it's the exhortation of the captains and the howling of the army. That's the passage that he's reading this into. So who are the captains? The captains are the principal vices. The 7. Where's pride then? Pride is the queen. So one of the 8 vices has now become something different, and now you have 7 vices. And what's the army then? All the other things that come from this, all the other vices that come out of the 7. Now, I want to give you a little contrast here. That's why I have St. Anselm. Did everyone then immediately jump and say, aha, 7 vices. We finally figured it out. That's the thing that makes the most sense. It has to be that way. St. Anselm didn't. St. Anselm went with a lot of the same ideas, but he construed them in a different way. And he read John Cassian, and he read Gregory the Great. As a matter of fact, Anselm mentions very few texts by name. We know that he read a lot, but he doesn't tell us a lot about what he read. Moralia and Job is one of the few texts that he mentions by name, and it's precisely because all the other monasteries want to borrow their copy. So we know that he's got a copy, and that he read it, and that he had it copied. What does Anselm say? He says pride is the fountain of all these sins, and he actually does a lot of analysis of pride. He talks about it in terms of what he calls propria voluntas, which means sort of something like an autonomous, your own will, as opposed to others' wills and the will of God. Privileging your will above everybody else's. That's what he thought the devil's first sin was propria voluntas. So pride begins it, and then pride, instead of flowing into 7 rivers or whatever you want, it flows into 3. And he's got a different listing. He's got these things like, curiosity. And then he's got another word that is very difficult to translate well, because we don't want to translate it just as enjoyment, period, because he thought some enjoyments were legitimate. But maybe illegitimate enjoyments or too much enjoyments, delectatio. And then exaltatio, that's a word, and again, I'm having a really hard time translating this, and I'm trying to translate the work that he actually takes this from, so it's not like I can rely on somebody else's. It means to be lifted up, but it means to be lifted up above other people or in a wrong way or higher than you should. And exaltatio includes the spiritual vices, so it includes anger, it includes envy, it includes vainglory, it includes greed or covetousness, and it includes sadness or dejection. Delectatio includes those 2 other ones, gluttony and lust. So he did something quite different. He didn't get harmed, he didn't get drawn into the it's got to be 7 thing. He was trying to think it out in a different way. And St. Anselm was not some sort of slouch. According to the medievals, he was one of the guys who, thoroughly investigated the vices and the virtues. But he went a very different path than the other people that we're going to look at. And here's where we now take sort of a turn. St. Anselm is in the 12th century, right after the Norman conquest. In the 13th century, something new happens. There is what's called the Lateran Council. And in this council, the Roman Church gets together, and one of the things that they decided is we really need to place a lot more stress on the sacrament of confession. And, up until that time, it had been done, but it had not been done in such a systematic, codified way, and there was not so much stress on getting that right. And now, the 7 deadly sins become condensed and sort of codified. Because if you want to make sure that everybody's on the same page as far as what counts as a sin, it's really useful to have some sort of, almost like a checklist, isn't it? Something that everybody can agree on. 7's an easy number to remember. So what we see happening at this time is a lot of different manuals coming out for confessors, for spiritual directors, having to do with these 7 sins. And they're coming about mainly from the 2 orders that are really tied in with this, the new Franciscan order and the new Dominican order, these mendicant orders of friars, who, they sort of take the ball from the older orders like the Benedictines, who are still around but aren't doing much, new. And these other orders come on the scene, and they're very dynamic. And a lot of the great thinkers from that point on are not from the Benedictines, they're from these newer orders. I'll give you just a few examples. There's this guy, Raymond of Pennafort. He writes what's called a summa. It's supposed to be like a comprehensive document that would cover all the different cases. And he does this for penitential cases. Let's say somebody comes to you for confession, and they have this sort of sin on their conscience, and they committed it in these sort of circumstances. What kind of penance should you give them, and how bad of a sin is it? That's what they would call the case back then. So he writes a summa, and he organizes it. How? According to the 7 deadly sins. Not the 8, but now it's become the 7. Another guy, another Dominican, William Peyra, he writes a summa on the virtues and vices, and he comes up with 41 different vices, and then he ties them all in with the different deadly sins. Now there's 2, those are kind of low order thinkers, or not I don't want to knock them, but they're not high caliber, people that we really put a lot of effort into studying today. St. Bonaventure and St. Thomas Aquinas, they are. These are 2 guys who also write about these sins.